Hi, and welcome back to Buff's Vintage Bikes. In this restoration, I'm going to take you through the rebuild, or the restoration, of this old Peter Allan steel frame bike. It was recently dropped off by me by a good friend of mine, who asked me to restore it for him so he can hang it in his man cave. The frame on the bike is nothing special. It was probably built from 025 high tensile steel. And at the time, these bikes were typically sold to newbies starting out racing who weren't quite sure if they wanted to get into the scene, or to schoolboys to get to school and back. This bike came equipped with Shimano Z series group set on it and a custom crank. I wasn't going to do a full restoration on the frame of this bike, as once I'd stripped it down I'd noticed that it had taken a little bit of a ding at some stage in its life. There's a mark on the down tube and on the top tube where the previous owner possibly hit a pavement or something very stationary, that's for sure. So it was basically just a clean-up. Here we can see the Francois the Toit sticker. So one of Francois' first stickers, and Francois was a master frame builder, who actually still is a master frame builder in Cape Town in South Africa. It's running a set of Weinmann rims built in Belgium, and as you can see, the old girl needed some work. An old fun ride sticker still on the stem. In the 80s and 90s, fun rides in South Africa, typically in Cape Town, were hugely popular and would see numbers of a few thousand riders pitching up on a weekend to take part in these rides all over the Cape Peninsula. That was in the heydays of cycling. So Peter Allan Cycles goes back to the early 70s, when the late Peter Allan Hooft, who at the time was working at Kriel and Binneman Cycles, bought the shop from Eddie and Henny and named the shop Peter Allan Cycles. The initial shop was in Voortrekker Road in Bellville in Cape Town. And then in the late 80s, Peter bought the house in Karoo Street as bigger premises were required. Peter initially started with imported frames and then just branding them with his name. But in later years, he got the local master frame builder, Francois de Toit, to build all of his frames, from the basic 025 tubing like this bike is, right up to the top spec 753 frames, although these are somewhat rare. In the late 80s, Peter employed the young Mark Weedle as his shop mechanic, and as the industry changed, he split his shop from the retail and workshop side, and Mark took over full workshop function from the extended premise at the back of the retail store. Mark was also allowed full independence to take on his own customers, as long as he bought all his parts from Peter. And so began Mark's bicycle workshop. Peter continued on the retail and parts side with his trusty staff members Louis, who was a brilliant wheel builder, and Glyn. In the 2000s, cycling had changed dramatically in the world, with the whole mountain biking scene taking over and aluminium and then later carbon bikes becoming the local rage. And Peter eventually decided to close up shop and focus on a less stressful job. He became a rep for Continental bicycle tires and spent most of his time traveling around the Cape, selling tires and chatting bikes, something he always had time for and something he loved doing. Peter was a remarkable man, always polite, always respectable, and always willing to assist, no matter how silly your questions were. He was extremely likable. Belying his calm nature, however, was an extremely competitive side, which he let loose when he was on his bicycle, and it was evident to all of us that had the privilege of racing with and against him. His own bikes were Thai Rallies, which he had imported and then branded in his own shop name. He had a very distinctive style when he was on his bike, and his long legs could be seen from miles when you were passing him in a vehicle. Peter sadly passed away in 2014, shortly after returning from the World Master Champs in Manchester. He was a lifetime member of City Cycling Club in Cape Town, and he is sorely missed by all of those who knew him. His legacy, however, continues through his old steel-framed bicycles, which can still often be seen on the roads of Cape Town. The old Peter Allan shop was bought over by Mark, who still trades from that premise in Karoo Street. Mark's bicycle workshop also happens to be my local bike shop of choice, as Mark has built up a wealth of experience over the years. From servicing classic steel bikes to the very latest in carbon fiber dual suspension mountain bikes, Mark does it all. Peter would be extremely proud to see the progress his young apprentice mechanic has made over the years. So back to this restoration. As you can see after the strip down, it was clean-up time of all these parts. Those handlebars in particular were a total mission. It ended up having 3 layers of bar tape on it, and that last layer, I'm guessing, was some sort of material. I actually couldn't identify it at the time when I stripped it off, but it took ages. But with a little bit of persistence, a lot of patience, I eventually managed to get it clean. If you've been enjoying this video and finding it informative, please do me a favor and press that like button, give me a thumbs up, and even better, it would be great if you could be a subscriber to my channel. I'd appreciate that. You'll see a lot more of these restoration videos of classic South African built steel frame bikes coming up in future videos. So because we're not dealing with a really top-end spec racing frame over here, I decided to go for a more burnished look on the cleanup. So how do I word this without saying like I didn't spend time on it, because I really did. But I wasn't going for that highly polished look that you'd typically put on an Italian bike or one of the top-end frames. So I was focusing more on having a burnish type look to the aluminium that was more period correct to what the bicycle came out. So the stem wasn't going to get autosol, much to my total disgust, because as we all know, I love buffing things. And having said that, I actually did put the crank on the buffing wheel, because these old custom cranks are one-piece units, so you couldn't really pull it apart. So just the way it was, I used a bit of the Scotch-Brite fine wheel on it, and then used some autosol just to get a bit of a shine to that crank. So these are the old suicide brake levers, so typical of the brakes of the time. And as you can see, also very typical of those brakes, they ended up getting worn out or bent mostly. They were super soft, that alloy that they made from. So every time one of these bikes fell over, you'd often find that those brakes got bent ever so slightly. And over years, they got a lot of wear on the bushings inside them. So to get those brakes working right, I pulled them apart, and then I took sort of each part, made sure everything was straight again, took a set of pliers and just bent it straight. And then I had to put additional copper bushings in just to take up all that slack on that lever, so that when you're riding the bicycle you don't get that typical rattle. The suicide levers often pick up a rattle on the downhills, or the tar road's a little bit bumpy. I can still remember it as a schoolboy, clearly having that rattle on the bicycle from those brakes taking so much abuse. So once I had finished these, they had tightened up very nicely. So this is the old Shimano Z series group set, and it was pulled apart, as you can see, each little bit individually. Something I want to mention while doing these cleanups is those little bushings or washers that you see when you strip a front lever. It's important when you are doing restoration to spend the time to get those bushings or those little washers as clean as possible. very often over the years they will have built up either grime or a little bit of rust spots on them. And if you rub it between your fingers, those little fine washes, you can actually feel that they are rough. But because that's a contact surface, you want that as smooth as possible. So take the time to polish those parts. I often will use a very fine, maybe a 2000 grit water paper and a little bit of WD-40, and I will gently rub those washes, the steel ones, gently rub it over the fine water paper to get them as smooth as possible. And then once you assemble it with a little bit of oil into it, you immediately notice how much smoother the lever becomes. So when doing the restos, don't only focus on getting everything shiny, like I have over here, but the little bits as well in between. It makes a difference to how smooth those parts operate when you take the time to actually clean them as well. So these calipers branded as Cherry, I needed to do some research as I hadn't come across Cherry calipers before. And it turns out they're actually made by Dia-Compe, who at the time often used to make that beautiful black caliper set as well. Some very elegant looking components came from Dia-Compe. These were clearly the sort of bottom of the range. And then it was on to cleaning up the wheel set on this bike. Now it was running normal galvanized spokes, not being top end. So I used hot soapy water and then a fine Scotch-Brite pad to actually clean up the rims and to clean up the spokes. And it's important when doing this, especially if you're using a Scotch-Brite pad on a rim, on the inside of the rim, to be very gentle. You don't want to go and scratch that surface because you're going to have to get rid of that scratch at some stage with polish. And the more you scratch it, the harder you're going to have to polish. So you can see on that rim, just a bit of Autosol took all the fine scratches out of it from our initial cleanup. The braking surface, you could obviously be a lot more aggressive with it because that braking surface of the years builds up grime and dirt on it, and it needs a little bit of force to get that braking surface clean. And also, as I've mentioned in a previous video, you don't want to be aggressive when cleaning up galvanized spokes. You're actually just wanting to get the grime off of the spoke. You don't want to get the galvanizing off of the spoke. Otherwise it won't be too long before that spoke rusts after doing your restoration. And then it was on to giving the wheel bearings fresh bearings and a clean coat of grease. Just love the hubs on this bike. These high flange hubs always look so elegant to me. I really enjoy them. The toe clips on the bike had obviously taken a beating over the years. The chrome was off. They were quite badly rusted. So I had to spend quite a lot of time with them on a Scotch-Brite pad, and then ACF 50 I had to put on afterwards to try and prevent rust from creeping in future years. That's the only thing with steel bikes. If you're going to be using a wheel on a steel part to get rust off, you've got to apply something afterwards to stop that rust from coming back. Otherwise it's just going to flash rust very soon afterwards. And I find ACF 50 to be extremely good at doing that. You just need to reapply it if you're taking the bike out in the rain or if you're washing it with a soap compound. So you almost treat it as you would WD-40, so you just spray it on the part afterwards just to stop future rust. And then it was on to replacing the World Cup bands. The previous decals were in bad shape, badly scratched, and they needed replacing. And I was very fortunate enough to pick up some new old stock decals from Mark a good couple of years ago. And these have been lying in a box at home, just waiting for the right moment to be set free and used on one of the frames. Peter absolutely loved using World Cup bands on his bikes. and it's a trademark on most of his frames. I got great enjoyment out of replacing these. Just the fresh brands alone made a difference on the frame, even if the rest of the frame was left as is, just polished up. And that brings us to the end of another classic South African steel frame built bike, a Peter Allan 025 tubing. I'd just like to thank my friend Ian for dropping off this bike for a restoration. I hope it gives him a lot of pleasure to have it hanging in his man cave, to glance a little bit of South African biking history every time he sees it. I'm pleased with how it turned out. It wasn't a full restoration, as I mentioned, on the frame due to the slight knock it had taken, but overall it turned out extremely well. The brake levers work a whole lot better now that they're straight. The bar and stem turned out a lot better once the stickers were removed off of it. That old Alps stem. Obviously some fresh bar tape, fresh cables and cable housings all around. The traditional Peter Allan headset logo. Gotta love those high flange hubs. They have a certain elegance about them. And the old Sella Italia leather saddle as well. It got a fresh coat of dubbin and left in the sun to soak in. And then I thought, while I'm making this video, I'll show you my personal Peter Allan, which I restored a year ago. I actually restored this bike as a tribute to Peter Hooft. As Peter and myself raced together in the Cape when I first moved here, and I was racing vets and then masters. Peter was a couple years older than me, so never raced in the same class, but we often used to end up in races together. Always enjoyable to go on a ride with him as well. Very entertaining character and had wonderful stories to tell of South African cycling history. Always enjoyed my time spent with him. So this bike was a Criterium built out of Reynolds 453 tubing. But I picked it up in a really bad state. I gave the frame a full strip down and resprayed it. And I put a set of Shimano 600 groupset onto it. And I ride it fondly. And every time I do, I think of Peter.